So the star of the show is the patch, right? Obviously, which I'll be honest, I kind of, hyped myself up a little bit too much. I was like, oh my God, a stream already. Are we getting like new characters or something? Is it going to be this big sweeping patch? No, it is a quick patch that can be done in a quick and dirty 1 week to 10-day fashion that covers, simple things, quote unquote, with a focus on hitting down the major things later down the line. The biggest thing that I took away from this part of the stream is actually the fact that they are planning on doing something akin to a league in the early access where they will be wiping the economy, resetting everything, starting up from zero. And I presume that patch will be, you know, new character or new characters plus what other large balance changes they want to make. And what that means is, or what we get here, is that there's a lot less of that, at least on the player side. There are some definite changes on the monster side. Example being that they showed that they are nerfing a handful of those monsters that I cannot stand. I am a huge fan of that. So, what are we actually getting instead then? It's mostly endgame improvements, just little quick changes they can make to the endgame. They're adding new towers, like new tower layouts, and they have like a new tablet that adds bosses to maps, or you get strong boxes that are buffed. They still just need to take away the smokescreen on them though, but like at least they're faster now. So we're doing better. Things like you're spawning more boss nodes, which the explanation for that was kind of funny. It was the fact that it is supposed to be 1 in 4, but there are maps that cannot spawn bosses that were being factored into the calculation and messed up the math, which I find amusing. Or buffs to Deli and Expedition, respawns being added to Arbiter. So let's start with the patch. The patch is just fixing the game, more or less. Obviously, not going to solve literally every problem in the game at once, but that's their words from the beginning of the Q&A. It's just like, hey, there's a lot of actual changes that we want to make when it comes to much larger scope problems, or even just, getting character balance in line and whatnot. But currently, there are things that were, denying people the willingness to play the game, myself included, right? That's a part of me. And this first patch is mostly just hitting back at as many of those issues as they could do quickly, which I appreciate, right? It's a good look, even if I think, maybe the whole stream thing was a little, I think the announcement of the stream was a little bit misleading in that sense. I was thinking more so that the stream was going to be a large announcement of content, when in reality, the content announced in the video was more so that of a forum post level, but it was to then also make sure that people were there for the Q&A. I get it. Like I get it. It was just not what I was expecting. I was expecting a lot more like raw actual content in there. That does not mean that the content in the patch is bad. Let me be real for a second, right? There's a lot of good changes in there. One, just strong bosses being faster is a small thing that I just feel the need to like shout out, because yes. Also, tablets can add bosses. Now they're, adding more bosses. They're adding more loot, or like at least attempting to make a shield more rewarding to do maps at a base level, so that you don't feel like you have to juice them in order for them to function, right? Buffing league mechanics that are underperforming, namely Expedition and Ritual, as well as Deli, right? There's a lot of things that they are doing better with here. They mentioned a lot of notes on visual clutter, especially with like visual effects that explode and whatnot from monsters that are dead already, that they're taking care of, right? If we get into other parts of the announcement, they even talked about like for pinnacle content purposes, the biggest one here, I think by far, is that citadels will be seen in the fog of war by a beam. This is a massive improvement to your ability to actually find citadels, so that you can then actually get to Arbiter. One of the biggest problems was definitely the feeling of just wandering like a lost puppy, hoping you'd find the citadels and then not finding the citadels. Definitely contributed pretty heavily towards the two-part problem of lack of availability of the fight, but also just a general lacking in direction as far as what you should be doing when trying to like explore the area. Which they actually covered this in the Q&A a little bit, which I'll later on I'll talk more about that point, because I thought it was actually really fascinating. Also, Arbiter will have 6 portals, at least in the base version, and it will reduce the number of portals you could use for the fight going forward, or like in difficulty. But it's worth noting that portals do still like reset the zone, right? Like if you die and you respawn in the fight, it does reset the fight. It's not like PoE1 portaling. It is still PoE2 style. You die, the boss resets. So that's actually gonna be really cool. Unfortunately, not being added to all of the bosses right away. There's some technical stuff that I know that they have to deal with for things like, say, Zesht, because Zesht is in a area with such a large amount of monsters in it. They have to make sure they get it right such that they don't accidentally create a scenario that is abusable through just literally dying and resetting to make more use of your portals to get more loot. It's a very like good consideration, but it sucks that it has to be just delayed because of that consideration. Which I think overall though, huge. It actually hits really heavily on one of the points I made in my recent video about how one of the biggest problems with one portal gameplay is that you don't get multiple attempts at these bosses that also take a lot of time to get to, especially if we talk about Arbiter in particular. The fact that they did hit both the inability to locate citadels and the inability to actually progress the fight together going to improve the Arbiter experience by a lot, right? Related to this, though, is also that they did confirm that we are, in fact, just gaslighting ourselves basically into thinking that the Jamin Citadel is less frequent. I still don't personally believe that. Like, everybody I know has encountered less of that Citadel. But their statement is that it's actually not a different spawn rate. It is just that people die to him more, which they're going to be nerfing his fight and a number of other things. Like I said, like a lot of things are going to get nerfed enemy wise. It seemed like, little just things that did not feel fair, which funnily enough also hit on things that I said I wanted to see from this patch, right? I wanted to see things that felt unfair to play against that make the one portal combat feel bad dealt with in a quick manner. And I doubt they will get all of them, but I think they're going to get a lot of things between the rare monsters no longer exploding still and whatnot after death, and the visual clarity alongside the retuning of these monsters and modifiers that are causing problems, as well as, extra attempts on Arbiter, with hopefully this coming quicker than faster than not for the other bosses. That's fantastic, right? There's a lot of item changes that occurred, or really the most important item change actually has to do with can't like overwriting runes makes using runes as a resistance fisting system a lot more reliable. It's worth noting it's an overwrite, not a like a swap out, so you do not get the rune back. Keep that in mind. And then they also talked about like getting some changes to how the weighting tiers on items works for like like tiered items and whatnot, which my understanding is it should make your items better on average. Don't think it actually solves a lot of all the gearing problems, but later me problem, right? This part we're just talking about what's in the patch. I'll talk about some of their philosophy stuff in a moment, right? And then the most important things here, if you're a console player, the most important thing you heard was that there's item filters coming soon, right? You get those in the patch, and that's massive. But two is that the probably the next major patch is when we're going to actually get the balance changes alongside the economic reset and whatnot. So prepare your mind for that. Just prepare for that. Which, before I get into the Q&A part of this, that's a good point to leave myself the opportunity to like sum up how I feel about the announcement, the announcement itself. Because for as cool as a lot of this information is, right? I didn't hear, baby, come back. It's time to play PoE 2. I heard preparation changes for when I come back. You know what I mean? Like, I didn't hear these changes and go, man, you know what I can't wait to do now? Load up PoE 2. I still can't migrate my SSF so I can do like fresh start practices if I wanted to. Still not a thing. You know, I'm not getting buffs to skills that I'm interested in playing that I haven't got to try yet, or addressing the like mace strike and bow shot issue. We aren't getting any of that. We're just getting things that I think we're getting changes that I think are very important. They just aren't the type of important that matters to me right now. They aren't the big thing that stopped me from playing, except for some of this stuff with like the Citadels and whatnot. But that relates to a different philosophical piece, right? I'm a huge fan, definitely going to love when I come back and I don't get sent to God by the Forsaken Miners, but kind of underwhelmed personally, given that I actually want I want more of a reason to be excited. But hopefully it means that when we get excited next patch, it'll last for longer, right? Not to talk about the QnA, because the QnA was a lot longer, right? Like I said, the overwhelming majority, like actually potentially over 90% of the time spent watching, was watching this QnA, which I'll give you a quick summary of my thoughts first, and then we'll actually dive a couple points. There's a couple points that I want to hit on here and highlight, whether it be quickly or in a little bit more of an expanded form, just to like point out some of the things philosophically that they said during the Q&A, which was one, very much appreciated their ability to attempt to answer some of these questions, although it was really funny listening to them give what I'm going to consider non-answers when it was convenient for them. One of the more notable examples was during a Magic Find question where they just kind of like ran around the question, and I was like, thank God, because I didn't want to hear another extended version of the Magic Find discussion. It was just as exhausting for me in the stream as it was everywhere else. So in the Q&A, the first thing that I think that we need to talk about that they said in there is actually this acknowledgement from Mark. When Mark is talking about the question asks about, the pacing difference, the quote switch that is being flipped when you go from a certain point in like early progression, mainly the campaign finishing, to like early mapping, is that the game starts to really just not necessarily what it was described by as like DM was like a change in game pacing. But I think Mark identified a much better way of describing this problem, which is more specifically that it's a switch flip in guidance. You get to maps and suddenly the game just kind of like balloons outward, but you have no real idea how to balloon with it, right? And the game, while offering you a little bit of guidance, does not actually give you a lot of interesting guidance or any meaningful guidance, right? Here's an example of what I mean. Actually, I want you to comment below while you're thinking about this, right? If you were newer to the franchise, right? You're not, like I'm a PoE 1 vet. I knew very quickly how to progress this system, right? It was just more about figuring out the nitty gritty details of exactly what was optimal for me. But if you're newer, I want to know, did you know, like, do you think you would have figured out on your own, like, how the, like, finding the Citadels part, like, actually tied into anything, really, right? The whole, explore around, locate Citadels to get the quest. Or, like, for me, I remember I didn't even do the Burning Monolith thing for a while because I genuinely just went the other direction on the Atlas and like I was in like T11s, T12s, and my homies were like, "Yo, have you gotten this quest yet?" And I'm like, "What quest are you talking about?" Because I didn't go that way, and so the quest just never showed for me, right? Or you'll think about like the actual progression itself. The progression itself doesn't tell you to do cool things. It just says, "Hey, go do some T2s and some T3s and some T4s." And it doesn't point you to all of the like mechanics in the game or anything. It's just kind of like open and bug splat. And granted, PoE 1 is the same way, but the audience of PoE 2 is much larger, much more unfamiliar with the genre. And also just because PoE 1 did it does not mean it was particularly right to do it that way, right? Like one of the better things that PoE 1 did was constantly like the multiple times that the quest progression was revamped to give players a direction to push in to learn the game on their way through. That was always a good thing. We should continue that in PoE 2. Clearly, we just didn't get it immediately here because, like, they were rushing till the finish line on getting things out for PoE 2. Understandable, right? So love that they acknowledge that because I think that's actually like a really good insight on one of the shortcomings of the endgame that I think is often not talked about, honestly. And that's why I wanted to highlight it here in like this depth because it needs to be talked about more. Now, two is that this QnA does show that they are aware of a lot of the things that do feel bad, like combat wise, such as things like the levers in augury, right? They are very aware. No idea what they're like. They still go ahead to like work to solve them, but they are aware. They are definitely receiving our feedback, right? The next topic that I guess is worth talking about just a little bit is their statement about Magic Find. And I'm only going to cover it here so that way I don't feel incentivized to cover a full video about Magic Find, right? Like if I cover it here, I won't need to make another video about their statement on it because I have some thoughts about their statement on it, but I think I can just kind of condense it here, which is they basically said, hey, by the way, rarity in PoE 2 works identical to how it works in PoE 1, numerically speaking, right? There was that discussion about whether or not the diminishing returns actually existed. It does. The formula plays out the same role. However, because rarity impacts currencies, you feel the impact of it a little bit differently. There was also a really cool take on two things in there that one of them that I covered in my previous video about Magic Find, and one that I didn't, which is one, the idea of rarity supplanting the role of quantity feels like a thing that you are kind of making up in your head as a player, only because you are disregarding certain drops, right? Like it's not that the amount of drops overall increases, but it is the amount of drops you care about that drop. And therefore, the way you look at the math for drops feels like rarity is basically the same thing. Again, this is talking about mostly currency, right? If you add rarity to your character and drop more divides, it is effectively if you added quant to your character to drop more divides, as opposed to understanding that all it did was convert, like, I don't know, a chaos orb or something into a divine through like the math of the rolls, right? And so that's one thing where the perception and reality of Magic Find is not lining up, which was a thing that they really pressed on in that piece, alongside this other thing that like they understand why people want Magic Find removed, but they said, as I've said before previously as well, that for as painful as Magic Find is to think about in the sense of, oh my God, other people are getting more loot than me, the reality is that it gives another vector for characters to scale off of, besides just raw number, like raw character performance. And some people like that, some people don't, right? All takes in this are fair, but it's just, they see it in the form of this gives additional stats to invest into, and it's a lot better than the PoE situation, PoE 1 situation, where you were just jamming uniques in that gave you these stats and nothing else, right? Very valuable insight there. I guess also more for me, it's validation that I like do actually understand the design of this game a lot better than I sometimes give myself credit for. But the point is extremely valid there. That's what its role is. The last thing to talk about with Magic Find is this perception versus reality piece, in which they said basically it really shouldn't actually be all that bad. It's just, when you think it's bad, and then be familiar with the term confirmation bias, by the way. Like if you've never looked into this term, get it, right? Confirmation bias is a very important part of this discussion, where we talk about how if you think something's messed up and then you experience it being messed up, you're just going to go, see, it's messed up, and run with it, right? So it's very possible that just confirmation bias for us as players is ruining our understanding of how Magic Find works. But I love that they said that, the thing is that even if our numbers internally don't agree with your perception of what's happening, the reality is that our perception as players of how the game functions is what keeps it afloat, right? So if we all perceive that it sucks, even if it doesn't suck, they still need to find a way to at least convince us that it doesn't suck. So they did say that they're going to be making changes in that department, and that's fucking awesome, right? Next up, they talked about warriors and maces in particular, as well as a lot of discussion around like minions. And I'm going to lump those two together under the category of build archetypes I don't give a fuck about. But they did talk about them and actually addressed a lot of the problems that exist with both archetypes of playing the game. And the reason I say I don't give a fuck about them is because I don't really play them for a couple of reasons, one or the other. The one thing that I really want to land on, though, is this talk about maces they had. And it's partially because I just kind of need to add a thought that I had while talking with other people, which is that they talked about like the problem with maces and how they can't really scale well because there's just this weird period where because they have no attack speed, they're slow and clunky and die and whatnot. But then at some point they just start one-shotting bosses, and it's like almost a design problem in and of itself. And to that I say, well, the mistake here is removing the attack speed, which is something that DM like harped on a couple of times. Like, why like so much reduced attack speed and like and whatnot? The attack times are really long, right? Do we really need reduced attack speed and long attack times, right? And the one thing I wanted to add is just that like PoE one managed to strike this balance a couple times with these like quote like mace skills, the like slower the slam archetype, and I it didn't involve actually slowing your character down. It was just about finding ways to slow down the pace at which you attacked, like pace, not the speed, the pace, right? If you think about like Sunder, for example, you only really need to attack during Fist of like, once every so often because it's just going to clear so much and it's going to do so much damage, right? That you aren't really trying to just giga fast it. Or if you talk about like Earthquake, right? The skill's design makes you want it to last longer. It's not really the game just making you use these horrific slow items. It's just the skill itself will last longer or like will do something to that. And I think that that's like a place that they should be looking into. Maybe put some more power into War Cries or something to really like fix the quote attack speed problem that those are having. Ugh. There's a lot more in here, right? Like a lot more that was covered. The last thing that I actually want to talk about, and it's one that I'm going to start opening the door on, but I'm scared because I know I have a lot of thoughts about this topic down the line, is the state of crafting and like gearing in the game. They talked about this and I was very dissatisfied with it. Just gonna be straight up. If you were in my stream, I was dissatisfied. And the reason I was dissatisfied is mostly because I felt like the questions being asked around crafting missed the point, and I felt like the answers also missed the point. And I'm going to leave it at that for now because I think it's going to take a lot for me to explain why. Like I just felt like the discussion around crafting focused more on the like lack of quote determinism in crafting a la PoE 1, which I don't think is the problem with crafting in PoE 2, right? Like if you've seen my videos about crafting in this game, while yeah, the lack of determinism sucks, right now the problem is that you're pulling a slot machine with no money. We should at least see about if we actually had money to play at the slot machine before we start talking about that. Like they showed us, they talked about like buffing essence appearance rate both between like essences themselves, but also if you can get more map bosses in your maps, you can then get more essences to spawn on more maps, etc. Right? Like it's the whole thing. But this doesn't change the fact that like how much does that actually mean we're gonna get more greater essences? And we still barely get white bases to actually use regular essences on. So I don't know what the fuck we're doing there, right? Or they talked about like buffing ritual omen drop rates, and it's like, oh, okay, cool, but how much of that omen drop rate is actually going to affect the good omens, and how much of it is just going to affect like gain adrenaline on low life omens, right? Like that's one of the discussion points that I like really did. I wanted them to acknowledge that we don't actually get to craft, right? That's what I wanted the crafting discussion to be. Like it's not the lack of it's not the lack of ways to craft and perfectly create the item. It's literally the lack of the ability to do it. But I have another video coming about this because their take on this in full, when I combine it with their talk about like penalization from death and their concerns about outgearing the game and whatnot, it opened up a lot of extra thoughts for me that I don't want to put in this video because I needed to take up its own space as a fully like dedicated think piece, right? Because that is a lot. There's a lot to unpack in what they talked about over a course of a couple of topics here. And there were a lot of other things in here that like I said, I'm not going to mention everything because it's a lot. And I'm not a news channel, just quite frankly, right? I cover things that I find interesting, and I don't think the news is interesting. Or rather, I don't think being a news person is interesting. I like to add thoughts. I like to point attention to things that I think are like worth talking about. I like summarizing things. If you want full recaps of this information, there's a Reddit post that has the full summary up, or you could use say like Rax's video. Where he, made a very nice note sheet and reads down it as he like talks about all the various things that go in there in a very nice, quick way to help you to save you the time of watching almost a 2.5 hour interview, right? If you want that information, I'll have that in the description so you can use that as well to like actually see what people are talking about in full. And otherwise, like I said, whole lot in there. I skipped a couple things that I even think are actually really dope and cool just to like keep this video kind of short. Like, I didn't even mention the fact that they're thinking about, changing the thing that you can't change ascendancies, right? And a number of other things, right? Like the inability to reselect wars on the Venom quest, right? All that stuff. There were so many things to talk about because it was a great long announcement. All in all, right? All in all, I'm disappointed in the upcoming patch itself just because I wanted a bit more. I feel like I need more as a player to want to open PoE 2 compared to other games that I could be playing. Not even just Torchlight Infinite, but other games as a whole. But I am a fan of the fact that they still did put together a good patch that fixes a lot of things that I did identify as problems before I started taking my break from the game a little bit, and that I am looking forward to seeing some of how their philosophy pans out over the next, let's say, month. And don't worry, PoE1 players that are watching this. Like, if you've been watching the whole time and you're like, where's the PoE1 mention? Where's the PoE1 mention? That's going to get its own video too. Because that will take over the entire video if I had mentioned it anywhere else, right? I've got a lot of thoughts about what they said about PoE1 at the end there, but we'll have to talk about that another time. Thank you guys for watching. If you want to see me elsewhere, links are in the description. I'll catch you guys later. Peace.